The morning sun cast long shadows across the desolate stretch of Nevada highway when Braxton Caldwell first saw the horse. Not the majestic creature it once was, but a broken shadow of equine grace, standing motionless beside a rusted fence post, like a monument to forgotten dreams. Braxton pulled his weathered pickup truck to the shoulder, dust swirling in the desert wind. 3 years had passed since he'd hung up his military uniform, trading the structured chaos of combat zones for the hollow quiet of civilian life. The transition hadn't been kind. Sleepless nights, phantom sounds of artillery, and an emptiness that no amount of government counseling could fill had become his constant companions. The horse lifted its head as Braxton approached, revealing a coat that had once been chestnut, but now appeared dulled by neglect and hardship. Its right foreleg hung at an unnatural angle, clearly broken and poorly healed. Ribs showed through matted fur, and its eyes held the same hollow look Braxton recognized in his own reflection each morning. "Easy there, big guy," Braxton whispered, his voice rougher than intended. The horse didn't flee, which told him everything about its condition. A healthy horse would have bolted at the approach of a stranger. This one simply stood, resigned to whatever fate approached. The nearby ranch house looked abandoned, its windows boarded and paint peeling like diseased skin. A faded sign reading Garrison Ranch, Esther 1952, hung askew from a single chain. Braxton knocked on the door anyway, his military training demanding he follow proper protocol before making assumptions. An elderly woman answered, her face weathered like old leather. "If you're here about the horse, he ain't mine anymore," she said before Braxton could speak. "Bank took the ranch last month. Horse belongs to them now, I suppose." "What happened to him?" "Bronco," she replied, her voice carrying the weight of better times. "Best cutting horse in 3 counties until he caught his leg in a badger hole during a storm. Vet said he'd never ride again, but I couldn't bring myself to put him down. Name's Granite." Braxton looked back at the horse, still standing in the same spot. "You mind if I—" "Do what you want," she said, closing the door. "I'm leaving tomorrow anyway." Braxton spent the next hour with Granite, running experienced hands over the horse's frame. His grandfather had been a horse trainer, and those childhood summers on the Montana ranch had taught him more about equine anatomy than most people learned in a lifetime. The leg was badly set, but not beyond hope. The malnutrition and neglect were treatable with time and care. As he stood there in the desert silence, Braxton felt something stir in his chest that he'd thought was lost forever in the mountains of Afghanistan. Purpose. The same instinct that had driven him to carry wounded soldiers to safety whispered that this broken horse needed him as much as he needed something to fix. By evening, Granite was loaded in the trailer Braxton had purchased from the departing ranch owner for cash. As they drove west toward the Sierra Nevada mountains, Braxton found himself talking to the horse through the trailer's small window, sharing stories he'd never told another living soul about the war, about coming home, about feeling like a stranger in his own life. The healing, he realized, would have to be mutual. Braxton's cabin sat on 40 acres of rugged mountain terrain, purchased with his military savings in a moment of desperation for solitude. Now, 6 months after finding Granite, the property had transformed into something resembling a rehabilitation center. The makeshift stable he'd built from salvaged lumber wasn't pretty, but it was functional and warm. The first weeks had been brutal. Granite's body bore the accumulated damage of months of neglect, and his spirit seemed even more broken than his bones. The horse would stand motionless for hours, staring at nothing, eating only when Braxton hand-fed him. Some nights, Braxton would find himself sitting in the stable until dawn, sharing the silence with a creature who understood the weight of carrying invisible wounds. Dr. Winifred Ashworth, the local veterinarian, had been skeptical when Braxton first called. "The leg's been set wrong for too long," she'd said after examining Granite, "and at his age, putting him through another break and reset, It's risky. What if we don't do surgery? Braxton had asked. What if we work with what? We have. Dr. Ashworth had looked at him like he'd suggested teaching the horse to fly. But as weeks passed and she watched Braxton's patient progress with Granite, her skepticism softened into curiosity. The retired soldier approached rehabilitation like a military campaign, methodical and relentless. He studied equine physical therapy, consulted with specialists across the country, and slowly, incrementally, began to see results. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Braxton was mucking out the stable when he heard an unfamiliar sound, Granite nickering softly, a sound he hadn't made since his arrival. The horse was standing at the fence, watching a red-tailed hawk circle overhead, and for the first time, his ears were pricked forward with interest rather than pinned back in resignation. "Look at that," Braxton murmured, setting down his pitchfork. "You're still in there, aren't you?" The physical therapy routine became more ambitious. Braxton constructed a series of raised poles and platforms, encouraging Granite to navigate, obstacles that would strengthen his good legs while accommodating his damaged one. The horse's natural intelligence began to emerge as he learned to compensate for his disability, developing a unique gait that was both functional and oddly graceful. Local word spread about the retired soldier and his broken horse. Ranch hands would stop by on weekends to watch Braxton work with Granite, offering advice and encouragement. Some brought their own problem horses, asking if Braxton might take a look. Soon, the mountain property hosted a small collection of horses that other people had given up on: a blind mare, a gelding with severe anxiety, a young stallion who'd been abused into aggression. The work gave Braxton purpose, but it also gave him something else: a community. The horse people of the Sierra Nevada mountains were a tight-knit group, bound by their shared understanding of the complex relationships between humans and horses. They accepted Braxton not as a charity case or a war veteran to be pitied, but as someone who understood what they understood, that healing often happened in the space between species. Dr. Ashworth became a regular visitor, documenting Granite's progress with professional interest. "You're developing techniques here that could help a lot of horses," she told Braxton one evening, as they watched Granite navigate a complex obstacle course. "You should consider sharing this with other trainers." But Braxton wasn't ready for that kind of attention. He was still healing too, still learning to trust that this new life was real and permanent. The nightmares came less frequently now, replaced by dreams of horses and mountains, and the satisfaction of small daily victories. As summer approached, Granite had regained most of his weight and much of his spirit. His coat gleamed again, and his eyes held alert intelligence. The limp would never fully disappear, but it no longer defined him. He moved with confidence, even grace, across terrain that would challenge healthy horses. Standing at the fence one evening, watching Granite graze peacefully in the meadow, Braxton realized that somewhere in the process of healing his horse, he had begun to heal himself. The letter arrived on a scorching August morning, delivered by a dust-covered postal truck that struggled up the mountain road. Braxton almost discarded it unopened, assuming it was another piece of government correspondence about benefits or medical appointments he'd rather ignore. The return address caught his attention: Bureau of Land Management, Wild Horse Preservation Division. Inside, handwritten on official letterhead, was an invitation that would change everything. "Mr. Caldwell," the letter began, "we've heard about your work with rescued horses and would like to discuss a unique opportunity. The Marble Canyon Wild Horse Sanctuary in Arizona faces an unprecedented challenge, and we believe your expertise might be exactly what we need." The sanctuary, as Braxton learned during a phone call with the program director, housed over 200 wild horses rescued from various situations across the Southwest. But Marble Canyon presented unique challenges. The terrain was treacherous, filled with narrow paths, sudden drops, and unstable footing that made traditional horse management nearly impossible. Many of the rescued horses had injuries or disabilities that prevented them from being relocated to easier terrain. "We've had 3 different management companies give up," the director explained. "The horses are essentially trapped in beautiful but deadly terrain. We're looking for someone who understands how to work with horses that can't be managed conventionally." Braxton's first instinct was to decline. He'd found peace in his mountain sanctuary, and the thought of taking on such a massive responsibility felt overwhelming. But as he stood in Granite's paddock that evening, watching his horse navigate the complex obstacle course they'd built together, he felt the familiar stirring of purpose. "What do you think, boy?" he asked Granite, who had developed the habit of standing close whenever Braxton was thinking through a problem. "Ready for an adventure?" 3 weeks later, Braxton and Granite arrived at Marble Canyon. The landscape took Braxton's breath away. Towering red rock formations stretched toward an impossibly blue sky, carved by centuries of wind and water into a maze of canyons, mesas, and hidden valleys. It was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. The horses were scattered throughout the canyon system, some in groups, others alone, all wary of human contact. Many showed obvious signs of injury or disability: old fractures, neurological damage, blindness. These were the horses that other sanctuaries couldn't or wouldn't take, the ones deemed too difficult or too expensive to maintain. The temporary camp was Spartan, a collection of trailers and prefab structures housing the small skeleton crew that kept the sanctuary minimally operational. The previous management team had left behind detailed reports chronicling their failures: horses that couldn't be caught, medical care that couldn't be delivered, and a growing sense that the sanctuary was more of a prison than a refuge. Braxton spent his first week simply observing, walking the canyon paths with Granite at his side. The horse's unique gait, developed through months of rehabilitation, proved perfectly suited to the uneven canyon terrain. Where other horses might struggle with the rocky paths and steep grades, Granite moved with confidence and sure footing. More importantly, the wild horses seemed to respond to Granite differently than they had to previous human attempts at contact. His obvious disability, rather than marking him as weak, seemed to signal something else entirely: that survival was possible despite imperfection, that adaptation was stronger than pristine condition. By the end of the first month, Braxton had developed a revolutionary approach to sanctuary management. Instead of trying to bring the horses to centralized facilities, he began bringing care to them, using Granite as both transportation and ambassador. The horse's calm presence and obvious bond with Braxton seemed to reassure the wild horses that humans weren't necessarily threats. The work was physically demanding and emotionally challenging. Some horses were too wild to ever be fully manageable, others too injured to save. But for every heartbreak, there was a small victory: a previously untouchable mare allowing medical treatment, a blind stallion learning to navigate with the help of a seeing companion, a group of horses with various disabilities forming their own supportive herd. As autumn painted the canyon walls in shades of gold and crimson, Braxton realized that he and Granite had found something neither of them had been looking for: not just healing, but a calling that merged their individual struggles into shared purpose. The real test, however, was still coming. Winter in Marble Canyon brought challenges that no management manual could have prepared Braxton for. The beauty of the red rock formations turned treacherous as snow and ice made the narrow paths deadly. Traditional horse management would have called for evacuating the animals to lower elevations, but many of the sanctuary's horses were too injured, too wild, or too psychologically fragile to handle relocation. The crisis began with a December blizzard that dumped 3 feet of snow across the canyon system. Access roads became impassable, supply deliveries stopped, and the horses scattered to find shelter in caves and overhangs throughout the maze of rock formations. The skeleton crew that remained at the sanctuary faced an impossible situation. how to provide food, water, and medical care to over 200 horses across thousands of acres of snow-covered wilderness. "We need to consider emergency evacuation," Dr. Ashworth said during a satellite phone call. She'd become the sanctuary's primary veterinarian after witnessing Braxton's success with the horses. "If we can't reach them, we can't help them." But Braxton had a different idea. Over the months, he'd watched Granite navigate terrain that stopped other horses cold. The rehabilitation techniques they'd developed together had created something unprecedented. A horse whose disability had become a unique advantage in difficult terrain. Granite's modified gait, strengthened good legs, and enhanced balance made him more sure-footed in treacherous conditions than many uninjured horses. "Give me a week," Braxton told the emergency management team. "Granite and I can reach horses that vehicles can't." The plan was ambitious to the point of seeming impossible. Braxton loaded specially designed panniers with medical supplies, emergency feed, and water purification tablets. He and Granite would navigate the canyon system on horseback, providing emergency care and establishing supply caches for horses trapped in remote areas. The first day nearly ended in disaster. A hidden ice patch sent Granite sliding toward a 100-foot drop, and only the horses' hard-earned balance saved them both. But by the end of the week, they had established a network of emergency stations throughout the canyon, each stocked with supplies and marked with solar-powered beacons, that the horses could learn to associate with safety. More importantly, they had proven something that wildlife management experts had thought impossible, that disabled horses could not only survive in challenging terrain, but could actually thrive in ways that healthy horses could not. Word of their success spread through the professional community. The Bureau of Land Management sent observation teams, universities requested data on their techniques, and animal welfare organizations began studying the sanctuary as a model for managing horses with disabilities. But the real validation came from the horses themselves. Throughout the winter, Braxton and Granite encountered wild horses who had learned to follow their tracks to find the supply caches. Some of the more severely disabled horses began forming loose associations with Granite, seeming to recognize him as a leader who understood their limitations. A particularly memorable moment came in February when a mare with a severely arthritic spine led Braxton and Granite to her colt, who had been born with a deformed front leg. Instead of trying to keep the foal hidden, she seemed to be presenting him to Granite, as if seeking approval or advice from another survivor. The incident was captured on video by a National Geographic photographer who had been documenting the sanctuary's unique approach. The footage, showing a disabled horse leading a human horse team to help another disabled horse, became an international sensation, bringing attention to both the sanctuary and the broader issue of wild horse management. By spring, the Marble Canyon Wild Horse Sanctuary had become the most successful wild horse facility in the country. The waiting list of horses needing placement stretched for months, and delegations from other countries arrived to study their methods. But for Braxton, the real success was simpler and more personal. Standing on a canyon rim one evening, watching dozens of horses grazing peacefully in the valley below, horses that had been written off as hopeless, now thriving in one of the most challenging environments in the American West, he felt a sense of completion he hadn't experienced since before the war. Granite nickered softly beside him, and Braxton realized that somewhere in the process of saving broken horses, they had discovered something profound about the nature of healing itself. Sometimes, he thought, the broken places make you stronger, not despite the damage, but because of it. The greatest test of that theory was still ahead. The phone call came from Washington, D.C. on a crisp April morning, delivered in the formal tones of a government official who clearly had better things to do than congratulate a retired soldier and his disabled horse. Braxton listened with growing disbelief as the caller explained that he and Granite had been selected to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom for their contribution to wildlife conservation and veterans' rehabilitation. "There must be some mistake," Braxton said, looking out at Granite, who was methodically working his way through his morning hay. "We just help horses." "Mr. Caldwell," the official replied, "your work at Marble Canyon has revolutionized wild horse management across the entire Southwest. The techniques you've developed are being implemented at facilities in 12 states. You've saved the government millions of dollars and thousands of horses. The president specifically wanted to recognize innovation in conservation." The ceremony was scheduled for June, giving Braxton 2 months to wrestle with the implications of national recognition. The thought of leaving the canyon, even temporarily, filled him with anxiety. More troubling was the idea that their work would be presented as some kind of triumph over adversity narrative, the sort of feel-good story that missed the deeper truth of what he and Granite had learned together. Dr. Ashworth drove up from Flagstaff to discuss the situation. "You could decline," she pointed out, settling into the camp chair beside Braxton's trailer. "It's been done before." "I've been thinking about that," Braxton admitted. "But maybe we owe it to the horses to accept. The recognition could bring funding, attention to the program. Or it could turn you into a symbol instead of letting you be a horseman." The decision ultimately came from an unexpected source. A group of wounded veterans had been visiting the sanctuary as part of a therapy program that had grown organically from Braxton's work. One of them, a young woman named Oakley Reeves, who had lost her left arm in an IED explosion, approached Braxton after a particularly successful session working with a blind mare. "You know what you've done here, don't you?" she asked, her voice quiet but intense. "You've shown us that broken doesn't mean useless. That adaptation is stronger than perfection." "I didn't do anything," Braxton replied. "The horses did the work." "That's exactly why you need to accept the medal," Oakley said. "Because you don't think you deserve it. Because you understand that the real heroes are the ones who survive and keep trying." The ceremony in Washington was unlike anything Braxton had imagined. The East Room of the White House had been decorated with photographs from the sanctuary, including the famous image of Granite leading the arthritic mare and her disabled colt. The president's speech focused not on overcoming disability, but on redefining strength and finding purpose in unexpected places. When Granite's name was mentioned alongside Braxton's in the citation, the audience erupted in applause. It was the first time in the medal's history that an animal had been specifically recognized alongside a human recipient. The medal itself was beautiful, a 5-pointed star suspended from a blue ribbon, inscribed with words that seemed to capture something essential about their journey: for exceptional service to the nation and humanity. But the moment that mattered most came during the photo session afterward, when a young boy in a wheelchair approached the podium. "Is your horse really here?" the boy asked, his eyes bright with hope. Braxton knelt beside the wheelchair. "He's back home in Arizona, taking care of the other horses. But I have something for you." He pulled out a photograph of Granite navigating the canyon paths, his distinctive gait clearly visible. "This is what courage looks like, not perfect, but persistent." The flight back to Arizona gave Braxton time to process what had happened. The medal felt heavy in his pocket, not from its physical weight, but from the responsibility it represented. They had become symbols of something larger than themselves, ambassadors for the idea that healing and purpose could emerge from the most broken places. Granite was waiting at the fence when Braxton's truck pulled up to the sanctuary. The horses. Greeting was enthusiastic but brief. There was work to do. A new group of horses had arrived during Braxton's absence, including several from a natural disaster in California. The real recognition, Braxton realized, wouldn't come from ceremonies or medals, but from the daily work of healing that continued whether anyone was watching or not. As he fell back into the familiar rhythm of sanctuary life, Braxton felt the rightness of the choice he and Granite had made. The medal was an honor, but it was also a beginning, a platform for expanding their work, for helping more horses and the humans who needed them. standing at the canyon rim that evening, watching the horses move peacefully through the red rock landscape. Braxton felt a deep sense of gratitude. Not for the recognition, but for the broken horse who had led him here, to this place where healing and purpose had finally found each other. 5 years after the White House ceremony, Braxton stood at the entrance to the newly completed Granite Institute for Equine Rehabilitation, watching as the bronze statue of his beloved horse was unveiled. The sculptor had captured Granite's distinctive stance perfectly. Weight shifted to accommodate his healed leg, head held high with quiet dignity, eyes alert and kind. Granite himself had passed the previous spring, succumbing peacefully to age and the accumulated effects of his early injuries. His death had been a profound loss, but also a completion. He had lived to see their work transformed from an individual rescue into a comprehensive program that had helped thousands of horses and hundreds of humans. The Institute, built into the red rock landscape of Marble Canyon, represented everything they had learned together. Its design accommodated horses with every conceivable disability. Its training programs taught rehabilitation techniques to horsemen across the country, and its research facility studied the intersection of animal therapy and human healing. Dr. Ashworth, now the Institute's chief veterinarian, joined Braxton at the statue. "He would have been proud," she said, her voice soft with memory. "He would have been impatient," Braxton corrected with a smile. "He'd want to know why we were standing around talking instead of working with horses." The dedication ceremony brought together an unlikely crowd: government officials, veterinarians, horse trainers, wounded veterans, and dozens of people whose lives had been touched by the sanctuary's work. But the guests Braxton was most proud to see were the horses themselves, now numbering over 300 across multiple facilities throughout the Southwest. Among them was Dakota, the blind mare who had become the Institute's most successful therapy horse. Flint, the three-legged gelding who taught balance and courage to children with mobility challenges, and Mesa, the arthritic stallion whose patient wisdom had helped dozens of anxious rescue horses learn to trust again. The keynote speaker was Oakley Reeves, the veteran who had convinced Braxton to accept the Presidential Medal. She had become the Institute's Director of Human Services, developing programs that paired wounded veterans with horses who shared similar challenges. Her speech focused on the revolutionary understanding that had emerged from Braxton and Granite's work, that healing wasn't about returning to a previous state of wholeness, but about finding new forms of strength and purpose. Traditional rehabilitation focuses on fixing what's broken, she told the crowd. But what Braxton and Granite taught us is that sometimes the broken places become the strongest parts of who we are. The horses here don't overcome their disabilities. They incorporate them into new ways of being magnificent. After the ceremony, Braxton walked the familiar canyon paths one last time before retiring. At 72, he was finally ready to step back from daily operations, trusting the work to the capable hands of those he had trained. The Institute would continue without him, its methods now standard practice at rescue facilities across the country. He paused at the spot where he had first encountered the wild horses 5 years earlier, remembering his initial feeling of impossibility at the task ahead. Now, the canyon hummed with purposeful activity, horses and humans working together in ways that had once seemed impossible, each finding healing through service to others. The sunset painted the red rocks in shades of gold and crimson, the same colors that had greeted him and Granite on that first overwhelming day. But now, instead of feeling daunted by the challenges ahead, Braxton felt a deep sense of completion. The work would continue. The horses would be cared for, and somewhere in the intersection of brokenness and healing, purpose would continue to emerge. As he walked back toward the Institute, Braxton could swear he heard the familiar sound of Granite's distinctive gait behind him. Not the ghost of his old friend, but the echo of all the horses and humans who had learned to walk with confidence despite their limitations, to find strength in adaptation, and to discover that sometimes the most beautiful journeys begin with the most broken steps. The legacy wasn't the medals or the recognition or even the institute itself. The legacy was the understanding that healing happens not in spite of our wounds, but because of them, and that sometimes the most profound purpose emerges from the places where we think we are most broken. In the gathering dusk, the canyon held its breath, ready for whatever healing would come next.